Good evening, everyone. I am Didem Ekici, Associate Professor and a member of the Architecture Lecture Series committee, along with Sarah Bartemos and David Izern. Thank you all for joining us this evening for the final lecture in the School of Architecture's lecture series, Ecologies of Design. The series explores the interconnected systems, methodologies, and social, cultural, and environmental context of architectural design. We ask the question, how does design consider the interrelated, dynamic, and evolving relationships between humans and living and non-living entities? Today, we are delighted and honored to have Kenny Coopers as our speaker. Before I introduce Professor Coopers, let me start by acknowledging that we are on the lands of Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Vea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the ancestral territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry their stories and their struggles for survival and the preservation of their identities. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois bears a responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that enabled this institution's growth over the past 150 years. The acknowledgement, along with the commitment to centering Native peoples, is only the beginning as we work toward a more just and equitable future. Kenny Coopers is a professor of architectural history and urban studies at the University of Basel, where he co-founded and leads the Urban Studies Division. Trained as an architect, urbanist, and historian, his research and teaching focus on the relationship between built environments and changing societies in African and European contexts. Cooper's recent work explores the planetary politics of design. His book, The Earth That Modernism Built, Empire and the Rise of Planetary Design, came out in 2024 and rewrites the history of architectural modernism for an age of rising global inequality and deepening environmental crisis. He co-directs the Synergia project, governing through design and interdisciplinary phenomena from 2020 to 2025. As part of this project, he co-founded South Design's Planetary Features. A related strand of work concerns the coloniality and world-making capacity of infrastructure. His forthcoming journal issue on African challenges to the coloniality of infrastructure and his 2021 eFlux architecture issue, Coloniality of Infrastructure, built on an SNF-funded project, How Infrastructure Shaped Territory in Africa. Related, he coordinated the SNIS-funded project, Infrastructure Space and the Future of Migration Management. Several of Cooper's books explore the role of housing in urban and state transformation, including his 2014 monograph, The Social Project, Housing Post-War France, and his 2019 co-edited volume, Architecture and Neoliberalism from the 1960s to the present. Cooper's also published on everyday urbanism and relations between design and use. His 2002 co-authored Spaces of Uncertainty focuses on the importance of leftover spaces for public life in Berlin. This is a theme he has revisited in his 2018 book, Spaces of Uncertainty, Berlin Revisited. His 2013 edited volume, Use Matters, An Alternative History of Architecture, examines how architecture depended on changing definitions of use throughout the 20th century. As an educator, Cooper is committed to the development of the architectural and urban humanities through engaged pedagogy and collaborative research. His 2022 co-edited volume, What is Critical Urbanism? Urban Research as Pedagogy, offers a toolkit for transversal practice in global urban studies. Public outcomes of this research-led pedagogy include civis corpus coloniality and Lamu features in collaboration with the Lamu Youth Alliance in Kenya. Cooper received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Architecture from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and he studied visual culture and urban theory at Goldsmiths College in London and received his PhD in Architectural and Urban History from Harvard University in 2010. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kenny Coopers.
Thank you so much for this very nice and long introduction. I hope I live up to all of this, these mentions. It's really fantastic to be back here. So thank you for this invitation, Sarah, Didem, and David. And it's a pleasure to be back here because I was here in 2012 to 2014. Actually, thanks to people that are in the room today. And during this time, I really enjoyed teaching and researching, and in fact, I had a lot of support also for the project that I'm presenting now. The book that Didem mentioned actually started here with a grant from the research board. So Illinois has been very kind to me, and so I'm also very happy to be back here and present the outcome of this research. All right, so the question that drove the research for the book that I'll be presenting is one that I came across time and again as I was researching and teaching 20th century architecture and urban planning. And it is the question of how we came to a peculiarly modern, I would say, conviction. The belief that by designing a certain environment, we can shape the people or the life in that environment. And that question led me down a bit of a rabbit hole, I guess, a study of the role of empire in the rise of environmental design that cuts across scales from the human body to the planet at large. And that's going to be the topic of my talk today. So much has been written about the impact of modernist ideas as they traveled the world. Scholars have mapped how canonical ideas, such as Bauhaus director Hannes Meyer's famous dictum that building is a biological process, propelled modernism in places like the Soviet Union, Mexico, and many others. And much recent work has countered such narratives of European ideas spreading across the world by focusing on global southern realities and exchanges. Much less has been written, however, about where exactly Meyer's thinking came from. Architectural historians have shown, nevertheless, that ecological thinking played a key role in the articulation of architectural functionalism. And here you see an image of Oskar Schlemmer's Bauhaus course, Der Mensch, man. And to designers, this suggested that humans are organisms immersed in environments that can be precisely qualified or quantified. So in other words, that their behavior and perhaps even their psyche could be predicted and potentially transformed by altering these environments. In search of the roots of this idea, a key inspiration for me was the work of historian of science, Georges Canguilhem. In his text, The Living and Its Milieu, written in 1952, Canguilhem explored how scientific disciplines, over time, answered the question of what constitutes life. And he traced how scientists gradually conceptualized the human as an organism in relationship to their environment. And key to this development, this scientific development, was the influential work of 19th century geographers such as Friedrich Ratzel. People like Ratzel, he argued, and you see that in this citation, were doing history by reading a map. In other words, they were explaining history not as a succession of kings and battlefields, which was quite common in the 19th century still, but by looking at the relationship between a society and the environment that it was in. Of course, these are all very much abstractions still. So he was interested in how people shaped and were shaped by the geographic and built places they were in. For much of his career, Friedrich Ratzel aimed to articulate general laws that would govern the interaction between humanity and the earth. But Ratzel is also a notoriously problematic thinker. He coined the term Lebensraum to suggest that a people or a folk would need to constantly expand its living space in order to survive. And this concept was later used by the Nazis in the 1930s and earlier also to legitimize their expansion plans in Eastern Europe, with, of course, disastrous consequences. Yet this concept of Lebensraum was also influential when Ratzel first coined it in the late 19th century. And at this time, it served to legitimize imperial expansion of the German Empire. German imperial expansion officially began in 1884, and by 1914 already, the German Empire was the third biggest in the world after the British and the French. Apart from the overseas territories that you see in the map on the right, imperial ambition was strongly focused on extending the footprint of Germany within Europe, and especially towards Eastern Europe. And here you see a map of the kind of footprint of the German Empire within Europe. It was much bigger than it is now. Parts of what is now Poland were in fact part of Prussia, and Prussia was the biggest of the constituting realms of the German Empire. So it was already quite big at the time, but for many imperialists that was not enough. They wanted to extend the empire towards the east and saw opportunities for German settlers to colonize and cultivate the land. At the same time, people in Poland, Namibia, and many other places vehemently resisted these colonial projects, and anti-colonial movements also shaped the historical outcomes of these colonial projects. Now, how does colonialism and anti-colonial resistance relate to architecture and design? To understand the depth of this relationship, I argue in my book, we would do well to focus on a kind of larger understanding of design and place that in what I would call a planetary politics. And by this, I mean the ways in which design and control of the earthly environment came to intersect with the management of populations. It has become increasingly clear that human activities, even at the smallest scale, have planetary implications, and sometimes regardless even of these intentions. Think about the decision, of course, to design houses without cross ventilation that require more air conditioning, right, and the kind of fossil energies that requires, global resources, etc. So because of these anthropogenic implications, I believe it's imperative to think about the planetary not just at the scale of the planet, but rather at all the scales through which we understand and inhabit this Earth. And so this idea of the planetary then comes perhaps closer to what Gayatri Spivak has called planetarity, more than, for instance, Christian Schmidt and Neil Brenner's idea of planetary urbanization, which always has this kind of idea of the planet as a whole, right? So thinking about the planetary also at the very intimate scale of the human body and how we interact with the Earth. So my aim with this approach is to extend architectural history to ecological questions as much as to global inequalities to which the design fields have historically contributed. And that means that we have to look at design through at once a much wider lens than we perhaps usually do, but at the same time take into account this narrower lens. And this is maybe the larger lens. Here you see a cartoon of the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, a meeting between European colonial powers to regulate the colonization and trade on the African continent. Taking such a wide lens, this conference can be understood as a kind of inaugural moment of planetary design in a kind of cartoonish way, if you want, right? The act of carving up the continent of Africa here in this image epitomizes not just imperial power closing in on the planet. Africa was seen as the last hatch, the last available a major resource for imperial powers to grab. But it was also a kind of design determination, right? This carving up as an act of design, of redesign. And if you think about the way that Africa was carved up, it had momentous consequences that we still live with today. The borders in Africa that were drawn at this time are still very much the borders that exist in Africa today. Through a narrower lens, German design at the time revolved around the aim of bolstering the German Empire's supremacy, both economic and cultural, during a period of intense global competition. German modern industrial design was not just a material outcome, but also an instrument of these imperial ambitions. At the same time, design was also part of a cultural discourse, and a discourse that applied from the beginning a relationship with an other, that which was not modern design. And so the civilized, these two images suggest this, right? The civilized world had modern design. Others, often considered racially inferior, others merely had ethnographic objects. At the same time, architects such as here Paul Schulze-Naumburg suggested that everything is design, and therefore design is about the shaping of the surface of the earth. In his book series, Kulturarbeiten, he conceptualized design as comprising all human activities that contribute to the transformation of the entire surface of the earth. So that's a very encompassing and broad definition. But of course, he had a particular interest. He was interested in rural buildings, specifically as pictured here, and in what he thought was the elevating aspects of agricultural and domestic work. The book was an absolute bestseller in Germany at the time and influenced a whole generation of modern architects. Now, despite this almost universal definition of design, right, the shaping of the surface of the earth, the architect, of course, the architect prioritized German forms to be most appropriate for the German landscape. And he railed especially against imported styles. French styles were his favorite thing to criticize. And he became a fervent advocate of the Nazis in the 1920s, writing a book about the racial character of art, which also had enormous consequences for the kind of artistic policies of the Nazis at the time. So the idea of a specifically German design and the idea of design as shaping the surface of the earth really coincided here, right? They seem to be a contradiction, but they're not in fact a contradiction. I would say they're kind of a symptom of imperialism, of a kind of differential inclusion. Everything is design, but German design is better, right? This significance of this way of thinking becomes most clear when we place Schulze-Naumburg in correspondence with Friedrich Ratzel. This map here shows the spread of Germans across the world, but it also suggests that by settling everywhere, these Germans would create a German Earth, as the title suggests. So this map illustrates Ratzel's theory that people's relationship with the land was not statically determined, but was the result of a dynamic process of people rooting themselves in the soil, right? Settling somewhere and then becoming rooted. So a racially defined people would increase its so-called Lebensraum or living space. And this theory of Lebensraum was deeply inspired by the experience of German settlers, which he studied extensively, and he was kind of obsessed also with the United States for its successful settler colonialism. He praised productive landscapes that people built in places also in South America, here Brazil, drawing of a picture that was drawn by a German settler that I found in an archive in one of these German settlements in Brazil. And Ratzel's theory of Lebensraum and images like these suggest that the settler colonial transformation of the land was the result of virtuous work at the hands of Germans. Of course, in reality, much of the hard work across the colonial world was done by indigenous, migrant, and often forced laborers. So the image, or the lie of this image, suggests that German work was also about a particular aesthetic, a shared, harmonious way of building, as this kind of settlement that is kind of integrated in the landscape here suggests. So what Ratzel theorized as settler colonialism, Schulze-Naumburg framed as a matter of environmental design, because Schulze-Naumburg was just as interested in the rural buildings fitting nicely and picturesquely into the landscape. So this resonance was undergirded, I argue in the book, by a kind of racist imaginary of how we inhabit the planet, right? Of an imaginary of planetary inhabitation that naturalizes imperial expansion and settler colonialism. Building did play an important role in colonialism and empire building. Right? Buildings structured the physical environment in ways that facilitated the extraction of resources and the control of labor. For instance, here in the German colonial port city of Swakopmund in Namibia, which was presented by German imperialists as the kind of main settler colony of the empire. And one of the central aims of this exploitative system, of course, was the control over land. Vast tracts of arable land were seized from African communities and redistributed to German settlers in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But that didn't go unchallenged. Herero and Nama groups, here led by Samuel Herero, the chief of the Maherero, launched fierce anti-colonial revolts. Germans responded with genocide, a gruesome history that lives on in Namibian and German politics today, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But one of the most immediate consequences of the Namibian genocide was that it created the conditions for a radical expansion of German settlement. And this expansion, in turn, fueled a discourse about what kind of architecture would be most appropriate for the colony. This building, the prison of Swakopmund, epitomizes this nascent architectural discourse. The building projects a carefully composed image of a German farmhouse or even an entire medieval village, if you want, packed into a single building. And you see this kind of layering that suggests, the kind of different massing of traditional farmsteads here. But this is a prison. And in his correspondence, the architect, Otto Ertl, stated that the building style and materials should be, quote, appropriate to the local and climatic conditions. And for that reason, he consciously chose ashlar stone masonry and locally produced sand and cement bricks to achieve his aim. But in fact, the roof was, corrugated metal. And this approach, or this, attempt to create a locally appropriate architecture echoed Schulze-Naumburg's call, right, for an architecture that would be rooted in the soil, or bodenständig. Now, it's one thing to advocate for age-old building styles in provincial Germany, but of course different to do so in a colonial context where those with historical rights to the land had been systematically and were still systematically being dispossessed, and so many had been driven to death. So the prison's style was meant to make German settlers feel at home in their new Heimat, or new homeland. But we can also read this architectural style as an indirect consequence of African anti-colonial insurgency. So to understand why this type of architecture would be able to achieve this, we need to go back a few decades. In the late 19th century, German reformers and researchers, such as the Prussian economist August Meitzen, whose work is pictured here, became intensely focused, obsessed, you could say, with farmhouses, with German farmhouses. And this interest in the rural past was certainly driven by anxieties about modernization, urbanization, and national identity in a rapidly changing Germany. So researchers like Meitzen viewed these old farmhouses not just as a repository of cultural and racial identity, but also as evidence of a process of settlement, historical settlement, that made certain people legitimate owners of the land. So the material culture of rural life, from domestic interiors to the roof shapes, so there was a lot of theorization about the different volumes and how they were distributed geographically, became an instrument that could be harnessed to make sense of what was naturally Germany, what was natural German territory at the time. And this kind of research even went further because it supposedly captured a timeless identity. Therefore, the farmhouse could also be used to reform society. So to make sense of why that belief emerges, or why that becomes so strong and attached to farmhouse research, we need to look at architectural theory. Gottfried Semper, the architectural theorist, approached farmhouses from a stylistic perspective. And you see an image of his book Der Stil on the right. And because houses like the one on the right had tectonic similarities with Greek temples, he argued, the German house had classical origins. So this is very much still a kind of template to reduce the German house or trace it back to classical architecture. But folklorists like the Henning, Adele and Adolf Henning, who are pictured, or whose work is pictured here on the left, studied farmhouses from a very different set of assumptions and searches. They were looking for, quote, a common basic form which explains all the later forms of the German farmhouses, just like the different linguistic branches can be brought back to an original basic structure. So rather than looking at stylistic similarities, as Semper was doing here, Henning looked at the massing and the floor plans of farmhouses in different regions. And their conclusion with this different way of looking was that the German farmhouse had nothing, in fact, to do with classical architecture, but rather was essentially German. It was rooted in the German soil. Now, this seems all very inane, but here is the beginning of an environmental paradigm of architectural form that will really continue to inform 20th century architecture. If you think about regionalism, critical regionalism, for instance, with all of its assumptions about the relationship between form and geography, or tropical modernism with its assumptions about climate and how that relates to form as well. So in short, farmhouse research was not just about documenting. It was not perhaps so inane. It could also be an instrument to make Germans more rooted in the soil, right? By building in a certain style, you would create a different kind of relationship between people and their environment. And so in short, what this theory allowed these people to do was to weaponize the farmhouse, being perhaps a little extreme with this word weaponize, but we'll see that perhaps this is not such an exaggeration when we look at what was happening at the time here in eastern Prussia, where the farmhouse and village architecture was being weaponized at a massive scale as part of a colonial project. This was with the establishment of the so-called Prussian Settlement Commission of 1886, in which farmhouse research became instrumental to a kind of massive internal colonization of this region. Eastern Prussia, or this part of Prussia, was a borderland region that actually had a large Polish population, and the aim of internal colonization was to Germanize this region by settling German farmers in modern villages with improved farming techniques. By 1918, the Prussian Commission had already settled close to 150,000 Germans in such villages in these eastern provinces, and you see that here mapped in green. So this is really a massive project. And that meant that the construction of thousands of new houses, barns, schools, churches, roads, machinery even, right? So a whole infrastructure of agricultural settlement was being or needed to be built. And the architect of that project was Paul Fischer. Not very well known. In fact, there's another Paul Fischer in German architectural history, but he's not related to him. He's been completely ignored, actually, until recently. And he worked as the kind of Baurat, as the official, master architect for this committee. And what he did was to study a range of farmhouse designs across Germany. He traveled across the German Empire and also to the east, actually, to where Germans had settled in places in Russia, for instance, to come up with a kind of catalog of designs of all the diversity of German houses that existed, and created a system, a kind of logistical system, of a catalog system, in which a variety of these types, following these models, could be built efficiently and in a standardized way. So this is the kind of typification and standardization that modern architects at the Deutsche Werkbund and later the Bauhaus were dreaming of, but it was being realized here at the German borderlands, right? It didn't correspond exactly to the kind of industrial methods that we'll see in the 1920s, but it is exactly the same way of thinking about architecture that we see here. One of Fischer's designs is the village of Golenhofen, which you see pictured here. And this was a model village of settler colonial architecture that blended modern technology with vernacular elements that would project or suggest German national identity and project that onto foreign land. And the comprehensively designed village featured medieval-looking houses, half-timbered houses, but also modern wind turbines and even patented cement walls, so new kinds of technologies. And all of this was intended to make German farmers kind of modern settlers. To understand the deeper significance of these designs, however, we also have to understand them as part of a project of racial engineering, which, by the way, failed in all respects. Polish farmers at the time in this region were organized and committed to buying land back from the Commission where they could. So land prices in the whole region skyrocketed, and this made the work of German colonization exceedingly difficult to realize in practice. But it also failed because of the lived realities of farming, what it meant to farm in this particular region. German farmers often hired Polish seasonal workers and rented out rooms to them. The Commission was very anxious about this kind of mixing, right, and wanted, of course, to racially segregate people, and therefore what it did was to create specific types, as you see here, new building types, specifically for Polish workers, for instance, and these, failed to attract workers because, if you can imagine, seasonal workers want, efficient, cheap dwellings so they can maximize their income during the time that they do the seasonal work. So, this project failed in all respects. Nevertheless, what this project does show is that this kind of architectural modernism was meant to expand German Lebensraum in imperial borderlands, and it was motivated by the conviction that social and also racial outcomes could be designed through the environment, right, through building types and spatial layouts. Now, you might think that the First World War and the transformation of the German Empire into the Weimar Republic in 1919 changed everything. But rather than abandoning colonial ambitions, architects folded them into new forms. So with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Germany lost all of its colonies and also part of its European territory. It was confined. It was parts were given to, and the creation of Poland, right? Anyway, so it was a severely curtailed country, and that was also how many Germans understood it, right? That it now had to live on smaller Lebensraum. It had less living space, and this was a feeling that was shared by political commentators much across the political spectrum. So we think about this as a particular Nazi proclivity, but in fact this was very widely shared, minus on the left, on the far left, on the communist left. for modernists like the landscape architect Leberecht Migge, oh sorry, I'm one too far, this curtailment of German Lebensraum was exactly why Germany was in a privileged position, he argued in this book, to lead the world towards a new future. And this new post-imperial world, of course, only as he understood it, post-imperial, would be designed following new principles. These would be geopolitical and also kind of biological principles, he argued. And he conceptualized this as a kind of domestic colonialism or a domestic colonization. And with that, he suggested that Germans, rather than expanding outwards, which they couldn't anymore, now should expand inwards. They should expand inwards by technifying the soil. So planetary design was a kind of technologically advanced form of land reform and agricultural modernization. And this would turn all Germans into garden settlers who would produce their own food. And you see in the book here these kind of designs of gardens as he thought would, kind of save Germany in the new world order. This idea of the productive settler was also echoed in Hannes Meyer's influential text, Die Neue Welt, in which he presented this iconic image of the modern interior. But on the same page, you also see at the top this kind of Bodenfräser, as it was called, kind of soil tiller, which was an invention by his friend Konrad von Meyenburg, which you see an image of on the bottom left. And if by cultivating the land, humans could actively reshape the planet, so both of these architects argued, or they could also change the very nature of humanity and its political order. So part of the New World was an idea of kind of the modern settler who would produce their own food. So it was in this sense that Bauhaus modernism, notwithstanding its new aesthetic and some of its emancipatory achievements, remained ultimately also undergirded by a kind of 19th century environmental thinking and anti-urban thinking. But Leberecht Migge's ideas of settling Germany also tied into a popular movement of allotment gardening in Germany. Since the 19th century, poor and working class people had built, maintained, and enjoyed allotment gardens on urban wasteland and on the outskirts of growing industrial cities. And these working class allotment gardens were shaped by a colonial imaginary of settlement, as you see here in this image, which is an allotment called Cameroon, which had been a German colony until 1919. And this poster here, also by the German Allotment Gardeners Association, had a call to create what it called permanent colonies of family gardens, right? And so this was the kind of more general or larger movement that Migge was tapping into. Working class gardeners themselves interpreted their settlements as a form of self-realization, much as they imagined colonial settlers, would be able to achieve in the colonial world, right? So this is a version of settling in one's own country. And this idea of settling Germany resonated very widely during the 1920s, including in canonical examples of modernism, such as this housing estate here in Berlin. With their functional layouts, modern amenities, and new expressive forms, these estates have long been celebrated as icons of architectural modernism. But for Leberecht Migge, who designed the landscaping of this estate, housing was also part of this larger project to settle Germany by technifying the soil. So despite his involvement in this project, Migge was also one of the first to criticize it. He found the gardens were too small for people to actually produce enough food to sustain themselves, and they were basically decorative suburban gardens. And for him, that was the wrong way to go about it. But of course, a lot of this also had to do with land prices and the realities of planning. What he then came up with instead as a project was this idea here to build a future Berlin, a Berlin that would become completely self-sustaining in terms of its food production as well as its waste management. And that would be possible if Berliners would massively resettle. So he drew plans for several of these garden settlements on the outskirts of the city. And in these settlements, settlers would use their own human waste, in fact, as fertilizer for these gardens, creating a perfect kind of metabolic urbanism avant la lettre. So he understood this project as a form of self-colonization. This was not just ecological design in his way of thinking, but also a geopolitical design for Germany still in an imperial world. All right, I'm almost at the end. So we get to the Planetary now in its largest scale. Because even with many of these designs remaining unbuilt, some of them still had considerable impact, as I hope to show with this final project. Atlantopa, shown here, was an ambitious and highly controversial geoengineering project developed by the German architect Hermann Sörgel. And he worked on it from 1927 until his death in 1952. Sörgel was involved neither with the Bauhaus nor the Deutsche Werkbund, so he was kind of not one of the typical modernists, I guess. He was rather inspired by the technocracy movements and also by large-scale engineering, for instance, as was happening in the Netherlands already at the time. With Atlantopa, he sought to physically transform the Mediterranean basin into a series of controlled land and water systems, so basically kind of massive infrastructural interventions. Colossal dams at the Strait of Gibraltar on the left and the Dardanelles on the right would allow to gradually lower the Mediterranean sea level by up to 200 meters, so he imagined. And this dramatic transformation would then generate hydroelectric power through these dams, as well as vast tracts of new agricultural land, which you see here in green. Part of this project was also a very much older imperial idea to make the desert bloom, in the sense of creating here in the Sahara Desert these new green areas that would serve and become the new kind of purveyors of grain for Europe. Now, this vision of earthly and transcontinental transformation was based very much on a racial hierarchy. Here you see, sorry, I think I missed this image. Oh, yeah. Here you see a kind of perfectly controlled and racially segregated environment and this is supposedly on the kind of new land that would be created, with Africans being disciplined to perform plantation work, and they're being controlled by Arab-looking men in this picture, while European bourgeois, the European bourgeoisie seems to enjoy the benefits of modern mobility and leisure. So Sörgel's colonial fantasy here taps into many earlier and disconcerting desires, but combines that with a kind of technologically advanced form of exploitation. In one particularly revealing image, drawn here by his collaborator Heinrich Kley and entitled Ethiopianism, Black Americans are throwing flaming torches and barrels of gunpowder you see also on the African continent. So it's clear that anti-colonial movements and black internationalism, as well as Pan-Africanism, were the enemies of Atlantopa at the time. So despite these enthusiastic attempts of Sörgel to sell his project, he was always unsuccessful, but not for lack of trying. He in fact very much tried to sell this project to the Nazi regime, which ultimately failed to offer support, as that regime was more interested in Eastern Europe and was kind of contemplating or equivocating between different kind of colonial projects during the 1930s. So, very much unbuilt, of course, this impossible project, but at the same time, you could say that it was realized, or that its way of thinking was realized in other ways. When you think about infrastructural connections between the African continent and Europe, you can see these kind of inequalities of who provides resources for whom very clearly. And infrastructural connections were built not just by architects, of course, but by a generation of politicians and businessmen who understood themselves to be a part of a movement. And this movement was to unite Europe by strengthening its colonial hold on Africa. So in the 1920s, Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, who was the founder of a movement for a united Europe, very much recognized the fact that the African continent, the colonization of the African continent, was key to that united Europe. So his approach, which later became known as Eurafrica, framed colonial Africa as a vital partner in addressing Europe's post-war challenges. And both Atlantropa and Eurafrica were visions, of course, rooted in the idea of linking Europe and Africa through large-scale integration infrastructurally, but also politically. Now here you see the kind of the many afterlives of this project, and not all of these afterlives are necessarily colonial in the same way. Infrastructural visions of connecting continents also continued to remain central even in the process of African state-led decolonization and nation building. During the 1960s, as African countries gained independence, the Greek planner Konstantinos Doxiadis, who many of you might know, drew plans for the construction of a continental highway network for the African continent, and he called this the Trans-African Highway. It was then taken up as a partnership between the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and the African Development Bank. So this was another kind of form of continental design. And this network comprised major roads, corridors that would stretch from Cairo to Cape Town and from Dakar to Djibouti. And its stated goal was to facilitate trade, promote regional integration, and foster economic development by improving this kind of physical connectivity between African nations. Now, there's a longer history about whether this was to be done by highways or railways, because that, of course, also had a particular politics, and it was very much also part of the kind of Cold War, global Cold War discussion about what, which Africa would be created in this context. But in this new cloak, design very hopefully would now, infrastructural design would now overcome centuries of European colonial extraction. Infrastructure would now finally connect Africa with itself. It would spur inter-African economic development and a new form of kind of African political subjectivity. And even though only parts of this plan were realized in subsequent decades, this Trans-African Highway has recently been revived as a project, now led by China. And this is another part of my research I will not touch upon, but I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. All right, so where does this story leave us? The image that you see here suggests that kind of fragility and limits of the Earth's ecology. And it was during the 1960s, we are often told that design became a way of trying to govern this planetary ecology, with the call that the human species should operate spaceship Earth wisely. But what I've tried to show today in a nutshell is that the idea of planetary design, or design as planetary governance, arose in the late 19th century, fueled by an imperialist discourse about the influence of the earthly environment on humanity. So in fact, it was already in 1879 that the American political economist Henry George wrote about the Earth as a spaceship. He wrote, "The Earth is a well-provisioned ship, this on which we sail through space." So already then there was a keen awareness of the limits, of planetary limits. And faced with these planetary limits, and particularly land, Henry George believed that humans needed to radically rethink their relationship with land. And he and other land reformers at the time believed that land should not be individually owned or sold as a commodity on the market, but rather should be governed fairly and equitably in the interests of all. So this, of course, didn't quite work out for us. But it would be my hope that an awareness of the kind of darker history, the darker imperialist history of ecological design might help steer us towards this and many other more equitable designs for our planetary home. Thank you for your time.
I have a comment. I got thinking about the relationship between farmhouses and the ubiquity of nostalgic thinking when it comes to design. And I was thinking about farmhouse modern as being the style that we see now kind of everywhere, and whether you consider the relationship between this kind of nostalgic way of now linking 21st century modernism and how that's an echo of maybe the farmhouse idealization that was happening with those groups.
Talking about nostalgia, we were speaking earlier about when I started researching this book, it really felt like a historical project that had not perhaps that much relevance, but 10 years later, the AfD is the strongest political party in Germany, and this kind of nostalgia and discourse about rootedness and who belongs, who's part of Germany and who's not part of Germany, has become very present. And in this context, again, architecture is politicized. It's the AfD that recently launched a kind of call for against the Bauhaus, kind of seeing that the Bauhaus is the enemy of German identity because it creates these kind of standard forms that are foreign and not related to the land. And I think this kind of discourse that's coming back, and let's just speak for the German context now, really, of course, creates a sense that there is the bad traditionalism and the good modernism for the people who are not into this white supremacist worldview, of course. And so that I think is also, not very useful for us who think about the politics of architecture to make that division so clearly and to just kind of reiterate this division. So in other words, perhaps the issue is not so much the style of these houses, but the kind of land ownership structures and the real estate that makes that possible, and who is able to profit from that, right? So rather than falling into the trap of reproducing that discourse, thinking about how we can create a counter discourse. But I don't know, maybe you're thinking about more specific American examples.
I was thinking about the relationship between the Bauhaus, who maybe was progressive in the politics, but in the colonial way, colonized the world with sameness. And then now we have farmhouse modern, which is nostalgic and kind of conservative, but it's similarly colonizing this country with sameness. And they're both maybe German, but they're both kind of opposite ends of thinking about what a totalitarian design is.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe somebody else has thoughts about this as well, but yeah.
Hi, Professor Cooper. We had the talk during lunch, and I must start by thanking you for this extraordinary talk, and it's so enriching. And I must say that I've been here from 2017, and you're perhaps the first scholar in the architecture school to engage with post-colonial theory that I have seen. So that says a lot about architectural education, although I mean the campus is full of post-colonial thinkers. So just to start with that, on that note. Now, as someone who is from formerly colonized geography and with ancestors who were displaced due to partition and experienced famine, I am very touched by your approach to unearth modernism as a project of colonialism in itself, and the way you show it through Germany's infrastructure that expands onto Africa. So my question to you is regarding, you touched upon it in the framework at the beginning of your talk, on the difference between, or you referred to like the planetary urbanism of Brenner and Schmidt vis-a-vis the planetarity of Beatrice Spivak and other postmodernist thinkers. And there is a not a contradiction, but there is a difference in ways in which these two concepts are approached. So in that sense, this is like maybe a continuation of the conversation that you had started, is that we are looking at Africa in your talk, and I'm using this as a kind of comparative framework, that we're looking at what the colony is doing on Africa, and that's the history of coloniality in itself. But it's also a simultaneous history of anti-colonial. Like the history of colonization is also a history of anti-colonial resistance. So in that case, we'll have to approach the context from Namibia to Germany. And so if you have any reflections or how we may do that as well, or any thoughts on that, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks so much. I can say that that was one of the biggest frustrations and questions I had for myself during this project. Right, it deals with German discourse and with fantasies that have disastrous consequences. Also not for non-Germans as well as for Germans, and it's really just a history of Germany in a way, right? It's definitely not a history of Africa in any way. And I think for that we need a very different kind of history, one that's I'm trying to do my next project, but through a kind of collaborative way to think about African built environments and what it meant to live and reclaim space in the wake of colonialism and remake it one's everyday environment. But I think that's that's not I think a history that that is that requires very different tools. Not this kind of discursive approach, not an archival approach either. And I think one I can talk more about when I talk about my other project. But yeah, so I think that it's just about accepting also the limitations of a particular perspective and a particular set of archives and a particular question, especially. Right, my question here was not. And it had any relevance to African lived realities.
I really appreciated that you were using the term like productive settlers. It was like German, and also you were showing this map of the migration, like people are moving all across the world and they're coming up with these ideologies of farmhouses, like growing food for themselves, like using agriculture as a way for living. And it's interesting that I look into the American immigrant landscape, and I was living in Milwaukee for a while. My research site is in New York, and the farmhouse pictures that you were showing, it's quite evident when we cross through these streets, like these landscapes of Milwaukee has been largely a city made by German and Polish workers. So these footprints of vernacular landscapes moving from Germany to all these places. Even these immigrants that I look into, they're actually mostly living into these places, into these built landscapes made by the earlier German and Polish immigrants. In that way, it's fascinating. It's not only when it's not only in Africa, but even in the United States, you can see this ideology and these people coming in and leaving their footprints in nuanced ways. And it's interesting that in your lecture today you talk about like the design as a way to govern the German ideology, and you look into these different scales of like farmhouses, then agricultural lands, and then finally into this Atlantropa, this very infrastructural megalomania, what I would say other than that. But I don't know, I know your research is kind of made, this book is mostly focusing from the timeline is 1940s, 50s.
18 to 1930, but yeah.
The 1930.
Yeah.
But how does this shift of scale in German design ideology or living practices as productive settlers, how does it, and also, it's also a lot of other things, a major massive shift also takes after in the post-1930, but how did it reflect laterwards?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so much of this history is overshadowed by what happened later and how people have looked at that, right? So the history of the Bauhaus, for especially in the United States School of Architecture, is a major thing, right? But within Germany at the time, it was one of many schools, not even the most influential one at the time. So it really is the Bauhaus going to the United States that created this, a very different narrative of what we think of as modernism. And so my aim with this book was also to correct that a little bit and to, really think about the kind of provincialness of German modernism before the immigration of many architects and designers from the Bauhaus and other places, who then went on to become, just as modernists are, I guess, good proselytizers of themselves and their own work, and and so that's really a difficult narrative to counter, or it's so established and ingrained in architecture schools across the world, also not only in the United States, but also in the global South, right, where these Eurocentric histories persist. I think it's a lot of layers, and it's shaped by what happened after that. So that's why I was going back and wanted to show actually how modernism is based on really quite staid ideas, because environmental determinism in geography fell out of fashion around the time that architects picked it up. So they picked up secondhand ideas that weren't really very, very, very top, that were already considered to be passé in a way. So that was the idea of understanding global modernism, or modernism from this perspective. And that's why also it's kind of a critique of, or not a critique, but it's a kind of corrective also of the kind of global modernism, or the way that modernism is told now as a global narrative of traveling ideas, which suggests that when these ideas travel and we look at them in all countries, then we have an idea of what global modernism is. But there's very little sense of the kind of particularities of the politics of land and life and all these things that shape what architecture is, what it means, right? So I think it's creating another fantasy in a way, and a perspective that is not situated, that I'd like to situate. And so I guess that's why I just stuck with Germany also.
Thank you, Kenny. This was really, really spectacular. It's wonderful. This is more of a sort of situational. It's a question that is probably hard to be specific about in terms of how you might respond. But how does class feature into this? I'm imagining these farmers going to Poland, and they're being sort of like, they're in a way, I don't know. You could say they're subjugated themselves in terms of, like you're saying, they're Germany colonizing itself. But who are these farmers in this ideology? Is it something that everyone is embracing, or is it working people or urban people going into the farm? Is it already folks who are poor farmers who are sort of colonizing other parts of, the non-German territory as it expands? I guess my question basically is just about class and who was it who was doing this occupation?
Yeah. I think that one answer to this is to say that a lot of this settlement or these ideas were seen as an exhaust valve for the pressures and the tensions of modern, of class struggle, right? So a lot of the people who defended or thought of imperialism saw that as a solution to the problems of having a massive urban proletariat, right? That would want democracy and reshape German society, right? So this was a middle class way of imagining another solution that would be less social and democratic. And so, people emigrated from various different backgrounds, but to Namibia, for instance, it took quite some capital to do that. So, in fact, it was quite a middle class thing to do. But this came with a kind of ideology of independence, maybe also gleaned from the United States and other settler colonies, right? Of the kind of independent settler who would no longer require a kind of governmental infrastructure, etc., right? But with an idea of self-reliance and all of that. But that was possible only for people who had certain capital in Germany. So I think most working class Germans would migrate to American cities first, right? And then, but I don't know any. I think there are many people who know more about that history than I do here. But yeah, so I would say that it's very much an anti-socialist, anti-democratic solution at the time. Yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Well, in the interest of time, I think we'll end. But I just want to say thank you very much. I mean, this has been an amazing talk, and I think it's also very timely because obviously planetary design is ever more present. But also, I mean, imperialist expansion, the ambitions for resource extraction, identity politics, nativism are back with a vengeance. I mean, if they were ever gone. So, thank you very much. This is a really...
Thank you. Thanks for the questions.